It was a dark, stormy night. Lightning flashed across the sky, and the rain pounded on the roof like 1,000 tiny drums. I was sitting in my room, headphones on, listening to the latest songs from my favorite singer, Elvis Presley. But something felt off, like the world was trying to tell me something important. I had always been a huge fan of Elvis. His music was like nothing I had ever heard before. It was wild, it was free, and it made me feel alive. But as I listened to the new songs from his latest movie, Follow That Dream, I couldn't help but feel disappointed. The lyrics were so simple, almost childish. "It's a wonderful life, this life I'm living," the song went. It sounded like it was written by someone who had never felt a real emotion in their life. I remembered the last time I had listened to Elvis just a week ago. It was a different world. He had released Little Sister, and That's Someone You Never Forget. Those songs were intense, emotional, and they made me feel things I couldn't even put into words. But now here I was, listening to What a Wonderful Life, and it felt like a step back. It was as if Elvis was trying too hard to be happy, and it just didn't feel genuine. I took off my headphones and looked out the window. The storm was getting worse, and the wind was howling like a pack of wolves. It was as if nature was mirroring my mood. I felt a mix of excitement and frustration. On one hand, I was thrilled that Elvis was still making music. But on the other hand, I was worried that he was losing his edge. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. As I stepped outside, the rain hit me like a wall. I didn't care. I just needed to think. I walked down the street, the storm around me, and I couldn't help but wonder what was happening to Elvis. Was he changing? Was he trying to please a different audience? Or was it just a phase, and he would come back with something amazing? I remembered reading an article by Hedda Hopper in the Chicago Sunday Tribune. She had interviewed Elvis, and he had said that he was at a crossroads. He was aware that his audience was growing up, and he was trying to figure out how to stay relevant. "The wiggle is on the way home," he had said. It was a bold statement, and it made me wonder if he was planning something big. As I walked, I thought about all the times Elvis had blown me away with his music. The way he could make a ballad sound like a love letter. The way he could turn a simple rock and roll song into a powerful statement. I knew he had the talent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned a corner and found myself standing in front of the old theater, where Elvis had once performed. It was closed now, but I could still imagine him on that stage, the lights shining on him, the crowd going wild. I closed my eyes and tried to picture it, but all I could hear was the storm. I opened my eyes and looked up at the sky. The storm was still raging, but I felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe Elvis was just experimenting. But I knew one thing for sure. I would keep listening, keep supporting him, and keep hoping that the next song he released would be the one that brought back the magic. I turned and started walking back home, the storm still howling around me. But in my heart, I knew that no matter what, I would always be a fan of Elvis Presley. And I would always believe that he could still surprise us all. After the movie, Follow That Dream, I felt like the songs I was recording for my next film, Kid Galahad, were a step up. The key song, King of the Whole Wide World, really stood out. I threw myself into it, and it had more energy and power compared to some of the other songs I'd done. My voice had that grit back, and I was excited to let loose on a solid rock and roll track. It was a shame that the song only came out on an EP, because it could have been a great single. But with my recent singles not doing so well, maybe they thought it wasn't the best choice. When the unedited version finally came out in the 90s, it really showed how much better it was. Home Is Where the Heart Is was another standout. It was a beautiful ballad, and I put a lot of effort into it, taking 21 takes to get it right. The writer, Hal David, said it was the only version of the song ever recorded. It was clear that these two songs could have had a life outside the soundtrack, and maybe even been part of my regular album. The other songs, like I Got Lucky, Riding the Rainbow, and This Is Living, were more lightweight and had a similar feel. They were cheerful, and I gave them my best, but they kind of blended together. A Whistling Tune was another one that was pleasant but not exactly memorable. When I got back to the studio in March 1962, we were working on finishing up the Potluck album, and recording a couple more singles. The session started off well with Something Blue. It was a great ballad, and I felt like I really connected with the lyrics. But the other ballads, Just for Old Time's Sake, and I Feel That I've Known You Forever, weren't as good. They sounded old-fashioned and didn't fit with the music of 1962. I tried my best, but they just didn't have the same spark. Fountain of Love was another song with a Latin rhythm, but it was pretty forgettable. I still gave it my all, even though it wasn't the best song. But Gonna Get Back Home Somehow was a breath of fresh air. It had a dark, moody feel, and I really enjoyed singing it. Easy Question was another ballad, but I added a bluesy touch to it which made it stand out. Suspicion was a hit in the UK, but it wasn't my favorite. It was catchy, but didn't have that special something that made it stand out. She's Not You was a bit like Good Luck Charm, and it was a hit, but it lacked the emotion I usually put into my songs. The flip side, Just Tell Her Jim Said Hello, was more interesting. It had a unique melody and lyrics, and I gave it a strong performance. The real gem from that session was You'll Be Gone. It was a dramatic Latin song that I had a hand in writing. It was held back for 3 years, but it was one of the best things I did during that period. I sang it with a mix of tenderness and power, like It's Now or Never and Surrender. The Potluck album had its moments, but it was mostly predictable. Some of the song choices were strange. Kiss Me Quick opened the album, which wasn't the best start, and You'll Be Gone was left off. The album could have been better with a few different choices, but it still had its fans. When I started working on the soundtrack for Girls, 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 in March, I was back in Hawaii. The film wasn't as good as Blue Hawaii, but the soundtrack had a nice mix of songs. I was in great voice, especially on the ballads. I Don't Want To was pretty, but the lyrics were a bit simple. Where Do You Come From was better with a nice piano part, but it wasn't quite as majestic as Can't Help Falling in Love. Because of Love was a bit weaker, and I could tell I wasn't as committed during the session. I ran out of breath a few times, and it took a lot of takes to get it right. It was a sign that maybe I wasn't as into the material as I could have been. Overall, the Girls, Girls, Girls soundtrack had its highs and lows, but it was a step back from Blue Hawaii. The songs were good, but there was too much padding, and the film itself was a bit too long and slow. Still, it was another chapter in my career, and I always tried to give my best, even when the material wasn't perfect. I remember when I first saw the movie and heard, A Boy Like Me, A Girl Like You. It's a pretty ballad, and I thought it was better than a lot of the other songs from the film. The song has this really interesting chord progression that makes it special. Elvis sings about a magic moment that lasts a lifetime, and it's a good climax for the song. Then there's Earth Boy, which has a Chinese sound to it. I think the song was meant to be nice, but the lyrics sound a bit strange today. It works better in the movie because it's part of a scene where Elvis sings with kids. Elvis doesn't sing much of it, though. Most of the song is sung by the kids. It's a good example of how some songs work in a movie but not so well on an album. Another song I liked was Song of the Shrimp. It's a ballad about a shrimp, which is a weird subject, but it's a nice song. Elvis sings it seriously, and his voice sounds beautiful. Some people might find it funny, but I think it's a good track if you can get past the shrimp part. There were 2 ballads, Mama and We'll Be Together, that were written for the same scene in the movie. Mama is short and has a Neapolitan feel. We'll Be Together is longer and has a Spanish flavor. It's based on an old Mexican folk song, and Elvis's version is a bit faster but still catchy. The movie had a lot of ballads, but there were also some fun songs. The title song is a cover of a song by Leiber and Stoller, and it's more of a pop rock number. It's a bit repetitive, but it's fun to listen to. Return to Sender was a hit and sounds a lot like Jackie Wilson's style. It's a strong song that combines rock, pop, and a bit of soul. 2 of the most interesting songs were We're Common and Loaded and Thanks to the Rolling Sea. They sound like traditional work, songs that fishermen might sing. Elvis does a great job with them, especially the a cappella version of Thanks to the Rolling Sea. It makes me wish he had done more folk songs. The rockers in the movie weren't as good. I Don't Wanna Be Tied has some good moments, but it's a bit derivative. Plantation Rock is one of the worst rock songs Elvis ever did. It's just not very good and doesn't fit well in the movie. The movie itself got mixed reviews. Some critics thought it was boring, and that the plot was too thin. Elvis and the other actors didn't have much chemistry, and the script wasn't very funny. The soundtrack had a lot of ballads, which made it a bit repetitive, but Elvis's performances were still good. For the next movie, It Happened at the World's Fair. The songs were recorded over 2 sessions because Elvis had a cold. The album was only about 20 minutes long, and the sound quality wasn't as good. The title song was Take Me to the Fair, which is a bit bland. It's sung to a kid on the back of a truck, which is a common thing in Elvis movies. Relax is a rehash of Fever, and it's not as good. Don Robertson wrote 2 ballads, I'm Falling in Love Tonight, and They Remind Me Too Much of You. The latter is one of the best ballads from the movie years, but it was only released as a B-side. One Broken Heart for Sale was supposed to be a hit, but it didn't do well. People were starting to want better songs from Elvis. There were 2 kids' songs on the album. How Would You Like to Be is really tedious, but Cotton Candy Land is surprisingly dark and effective. Beyond the Bend is a bright song for the opening credits, but it's not very deep. A World of Our Own is a mediocre ballad that sounds like a Don Robertson song but isn't. Happy Ending is a weak song, and Elvis's voice sounds off, especially in the low notes. The movie didn't get much attention, and the reviews were mostly negative. Critics thought it was boring, and that Elvis's acting wasn't very good. It was clear that people wanted more from Elvis, and the next movie would have to be better. I couldn't believe how things had changed since I got back from the army. My movies, which used to be so fun and exciting, had turned into these dull, formulaic things. Girls, 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 and It Happened at the World's Fair were supposed to be the next big things, but they ended up being some of the dullest films I ever made. They were professional and slick, sure, but they lacked the energy and fun that made movies like Blue Hawaii and GI Blues so great, but it wasn't all bad. The next year, I got to make Fun in Acapulco, Viva Las Vegas, and Roustabout, and those movies brought back some of the fun and energy I had been missing. I was enjoying myself again, and it showed in the music and the performances, but then things started to slip again. I found myself on a production line, making movie after movie and soundtrack after soundtrack without much thought. There were a lot of people to blame for this. Some said it was my manager, Colonel Parker, who was pushing me too hard. Others said it was the studios, churning out these movies for quick profits. But when I talked to a journalist named Lloyd Shearer on the set of It Happened at the World's Fair, I realized that I had a part in it too. I was comfortable with what I was doing, and I didn't want to take any risks. I didn't want to lose the audience that loved me, so I stuck to what worked, even if it meant I wasn't growing as an artist. Around this time, I also gave a couple of other interviews. One was with a British journalist named Robin Douglas Home. Getting access to me was tough, and even when he did, Colonel Parker was always watching. But even with all that, I opened up a bit. I talked about how my musical tastes were much broader than just rock and roll. I had a huge record collection, from classical music to jazz and even comedy albums. It was a side of me that not many people knew. Another interview was with Jane Ardmore. That one was a lot more personal. I talked about how losing my mom had affected me. It was one of the hardest things I had ever gone through. But I also talked about my faith, and how it helped me get through tough times. It was a mix of joking around and being really serious, and it showed the different sides of me. As the years went on, my music and movies started to suffer. The quality of my recordings had been slipping for a while, and by 1963, it was starting to show in sales and reviews. Fans and critics were giving me some slack at first, but when the lackluster stuff kept coming, they got tired of it. There were a few bright spots, like the sessions for Fun in Acapulco and Viva Las Vegas, but then it was mostly downhill. In January 1963, I had a studio session for Fun in Acapulco. The Mexican theme was a lot of fun, and it brought out some good energy. Bossa Nova Baby was a standout, even if it wasn't exactly bossa nova. The music and the lyrics were smart and sassy, and I really enjoyed singing it. I Think I'm Gonna Like It Here, and Margarita were also good with a nice Mexican feel. El Toro and The Bullfighter Was a Lady were fun and a bit silly, which was a nice change, but not everything was great. You Can't Say No in Acapulco and Guadalajara were a bit hit or miss, and No Room to Roomba in a Sports Car was just plain daft. But even the silly stuff had its moments, and I tried to have fun with it. Critics were actually pretty kind to the movie and the soundtrack. Howard Thompson from the New York Times even said it was my best musical feature to date. That was a big deal, especially after the duds that came before it. In May 1963, I had another studio session, but it wasn't as successful. Echoes of Love was a real letdown. It was just too repetitive and boring. I knew it wasn't great, but sometimes you just have to do what the studio wants. It was a tough time, but I was still trying to find my way back to the fun and the energy that made my early work so special. I remember the song Please Don't Drag That String Around woke up Elvis and the band. They sounded much more lively on this track compared to One Broken Heart for Sale, which didn't do so well on the charts. I felt this song was better, even though the lyrics reminded me a bit of Teddy Bear and Wear My Ring Around Your Neck. The chorus stuck in my head, but the arrangement seemed a bit flat, without much build-up or a big finish. Devil in Disguise was a big hit and brought Elvis back to the top 10. It was perfect for the radio, with its catchy changes between slow and fast parts. Elvis sang it brilliantly, using his soft voice for the slow parts and getting more powerful during the choruses. The song was even used without permission in a movie called Scorpio Rising, which was pretty controversial. Never Ending was one of Elvis's best attempts at a Latin rhythm. It had a strong melody that grew within each verse, giving Elvis something to really sink his teeth into. The chorus, which repeated the song's title, wasn't as exciting, but Elvis's smooth voice made the song stand out. It reminded me a bit of Sam Cooke's style. What Now, What Next, Where To felt like Elvis was questioning his own career. It was a medium-paced ballad with a country feel, but it wasn't very memorable. The writers, Don Robertson and Hal Blair, seemed to be running out of ideas, which was a bit disappointing. Finders Keeps, Losers Weepers had a similar feel to the other songs. Elvis's performances were good, but it seemed like less effort was being put into the recordings. 8 out of the 12 songs recorded were done in fewer than 5 takes, which suggested a lack of attention to detail. Witchcraft was a song Elvis transformed. He ditched the straightforward rhythm of the original and added a contemporary twist, making it feel like a mix between Fever and Such a Night. It wasn't as good as those songs, but it showed what Elvis could do with better material. Love Me Tonight by Don Robertson felt like a diluted version of There's Always Me. Elvis gave a beautiful performance, but it didn't have much impact. Slowly but Surely reminded me of Put the Blame on Me, and while neither were bad, they felt like they were relying too much on past hits. Western Union had lyrics that sounded a lot like Return to Sender, about unanswered letters and phone calls. It was almost embarrassing, but Elvis's serious and appealing performance made it better. Long Lonely Highway was different. The lyrics were dark, talking about death and even suggesting suicide. Elvis missed the dark element in his performance, which was odd given the content. It sounded more upbeat than it should have. Some songs were left unfinished, like Ask Me and Memphis, Tennessee, which were re-recorded the next year. Blue River was released as a B-side, but it sounded like Elvis was losing focus by that point. These recordings were a mixed bag, but they were livelier than some of the earlier ones. Songs like Devil in Disguise, Witchcraft, and Never Ending showed that Elvis could still deliver when he wanted to, but he often took the easy route. When it came to Viva Las Vegas, the reviews were mixed. Some critics called it pleasant and unimportant, while others praised the chemistry between Elvis and Anne Margaret. The songs ranged from great to not so great, and the film had its faults, especially the rushed ending. But it was still fun to watch, and maybe better than some of his other movies. The title song, Viva Las Vegas, was catchy and energetic, even though it was only a B-side in America. What I Say was a chaotic cover of Ray Charles's song, but it didn't quite work. Nightlife had a bluesy feel and was brought to life by Elvis's laid-back vocal and Billy Strange's guitar. Come On Everybody was a weak rock and roll number, and If You Think I Don't Need You had a Ray Charles feel but wasn't as strong as it could have been. The best song was I Need Somebody to Lean On. It was a great torch song with a simple trio backing. Elvis's jazz-styled vocals were a rare but welcome change. The scene in the film was also striking, with Elvis not singing but the song playing over the scene. The two ballads, Santa Lucia and another based on a classical piece, were pleasant but not very memorable. Elvis got ahead of the beat in Santa Lucia, which could have been improved with another take. Overall, these sessions showed that Elvis could still deliver when given good material, but he was often settling for less. I remember working on Today, Tomorrow and Forever, a song based on Franz Liszt's Liebestraum. I really liked how it turned out. My performance was more restrained, which I thought suited the song. There was a duet version with Anne Margaret, but it was never released until much later. The solo version is way better. Anne's voice just didn't blend well with mine on this one. Another duet with Anne was The Lady Loves Me. It was a fun, comedic song, but it felt a bit too long. The best part was the chemistry between us, especially when you saw it in the film. The lyrics had some clever wordplay, but the ending didn't quite work outside the movie context. The final duet, You're the Boss, was amazing. Ernst Jorgensen called it wonderfully seductive, and he's right. Anne and I were both really restrained, almost like we were doing oral foreplay. It was a shame this one wasn't released for almost 30 years. When it came to the solo numbers, Do the Vega was a bit of a dud. It was supposed to start a new dance craze, but it didn't. Still, it was kind of likable, silly nonsense. Do the Clam, from Girl Happy, was even worse, though. Another song, a medley of The Yellow Rose of Texas and The Eyes of Texas, was pretty rough. It sounded like I was singing with a bunch of drunks, and it shouldn't have been on the record. The soundtrack had its ups and downs, but there was more good than bad. Not releasing it as an LP was a mystery, especially since 1964 had room for more albums. For Kissin' Cousins, the film and soundtrack didn't go well. Critics were not kind. Howard Thompson from the New York Times said, "For Pete's sake, Elle," and called the film tired, strained, and familiar. Variety also panned it, saying I needed better material if my career was to keep thriving. They pointed out that the film was made quickly and cheaply, and the director, Gene Nelson, didn't do much to elevate it. The album was recorded with the band laying down tracks first, and I overdubbed my vocals later. Once Is Enough was one of the better songs, but it still had cliched lyrics. My voice sounded different, more self-conscious. Catchin' On Fast was awful, with no melody, and I struggled to stay in tune. Anyone was a decent ballad, and I sang it well, but it was just average. Tender Feeling, based on Shenandoah, had a strong melody, but the lyrics were weak, and the instrumentation was off. One Boy, Two Little Girls was sappy, and it was weird hearing me sing about being a boy in love with little girls. Kissin' Cousins, the song was a rock and roll number, but it felt outdated. The novelty of me duetting with myself didn't help. Kissin' Cousins No. 2 was even worse, with my vocal lost in echo. Smoky Mountain Boy was a nursery rhyme like Diddy, and There's Gold in the Mountains had grating female vocals that drowned me out. Barefoot Ballad was another embarrassing track, with me in mock Tennessee twang mode. This was a low point in my career. I should have demanded better material. Colonel Tom Parker was all about the money, and he said, "As long as the studios come up with the loot, we'll make the deal." I went along with it, even though I knew it wasn't good for my artistry. In January 1964, I had a studio session that produced some of my best tracks since 1960. Memphis, Tennessee was a Chuck Berry song I wanted to re-record. The drum beat was powerful, and my vocal was more moving than Berry's. Ask Me was a ballad based on an Italian song, and it did well on the charts. It Hurts Me was the best of the bunch. It was a soulful ballad with a triplet beat, and I really poured my heart into it. It was one of my greatest recordings, but I was still wasting my voice on bad songs most of the time. After my January recording session in 1964, where I made some really great songs like It Hurts Me, I didn't step back into the studio for a long time. For over 2 years, I only recorded music for my movies. It's a bit of a mystery why I stopped making regular music. Some people think it was because I was too busy with movies, but I had shown before that I could record a lot of songs in just a couple of nights. Others say there was no room in the release schedule for a new album. But that doesn't make sense either, because RCA still put out Elvis for Everyone in 1965, which was a mix of old and new songs. Maybe the real reason was that I was having trouble finding good songs to record. I had moved away from rock and roll to a more pop sound, but it didn't feel like it was going anywhere. I think I needed some time to figure out what I wanted to do next. I spent a lot of time at home, singing and playing all sorts of songs, just like I did before I came back from the army. This helped me find my way back to making great music, which you can hear in the How Great Thou Art sessions in 1966. In March, April, and May of 1964, I was working on a movie called Roustabout. The soundtrack for this film did really well, even though some people didn't think it was that great. The title song, Roustabout, was a fun little tune, but the mix made my voice sound far away, and the backup singers were too loud. There was another version of the title song called I'm a Roustabout, but it was never released until much later. One of the songs, Little Egypt, was a funny song about a belly dancer. It was a bit hard to hear clearly, but it was still a good track. Poison Ivy League showed a bit of my rebellious side, but my voice wasn't as strong as it used to be. Despite that, the song was still fun to listen to. Big Love, Big Heartache was the closest thing to a ballad on the album, but it wasn't one of my best. The lyrics were weak, and I didn't sing it with much confidence. There's a Brand New Day on the Horizon was a bright and breezy song, but it didn't have much depth. The album also had a couple of short songs about the carnival, Carney Town and It's Carnival Time, which were okay but not very exciting. There were a few mysteries about the recording sessions, like why I'm a Roustabout was recorded but not used, and why there might have been another song that was attempted but not included. It's hard to know for sure without finding the missing tapes. In June of 1964, I recorded the soundtrack for Girl Happy. The title track was pretty bland, and it was sped up to make it sound more exciting, but it just sounded silly. Spring Fever was another weak song, and my voice didn't sound great. Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce had a nice melody, but the recording was really dry and didn't do it justice. Startin' Tonight was one of the worst songs I recorded during this time. I didn't even try to make it sound good. I just mumbled the verses and yelled the chorus. It was clear that I was getting frustrated with the quality of the movie soundtracks. Even though some of these songs were fun, they didn't really fit with what was happening in music at the time. The Beatles and other British bands were taking over, and I was starting to feel like I was a part of the past. It would take a few more years before I found my way back to making the kind of music that people really wanted to hear. As I reflect on the songs I recorded for Harum Scarum, it's clear that my career in Hollywood had taken a nosedive. The movie itself, with its wacky plot about a Hollywood star in a mythical Arab kingdom, didn't do me any favors. I wandered through the film like I was in a daze, and the script didn't help. But even in a movie that could have been a total disaster, I managed to keep things afloat with my music. The first song, Hareem Holiday, wasn't a great start. The opening line was so out of tune that it sounded like we were all playing in different keys. I guess I wasn't feeling it that day. But I tried my best, and at least the song had some nice rhymes, even if it didn't quite hit the mark. My Desert Serenade was a bit better, with a real melody and a touch of professionalism. The oboe in the background was a nice touch, even if it was a bit too low in the mix. I sounded a bit more awake here, and the song had a better vibe. Go East, Young Man had a playful feel, and I felt more engaged. The backing vocals were great, and the song had a charm that made it stand out a little. It wasn't a standout, but it was better than most of the stuff I'd been recording. Mirage was a bit too fast for the melody, but I tried to make the most of it, especially during the bridge. The lyrics were pretty basic, but the music had some appeal. Kismet was another gentle ballad, and I think I did a decent job with it. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was the kind of song I could make sound better than it was. I had a knack for that. Shake That Tambourine took forever to record with around 40 takes. I was finally awake, but the song wasn't worth the effort. It was a bit of a waste of time, but at least I was trying. Hey Little Girl Started with a funky piano riff, but it fell apart once I started singing. I tried to sound enthusiastic with my grunts and shouts, but it felt forced. I wasn't really feeling it, and it showed. Despite the poor reviews and the lackluster material, the movies were still making money. Tickle Me had saved Allied artists from ruin, and I was on track to be the highest-earning star in Hollywood. But the artistic side of things was suffering. People who knew me well, like Norman Torog, believed I could be a great actor if given the chance. But Colonel Parker was content with the formula that was making us rich. I was starting to feel the weight of it all. I was turning 30, and I knew I could do more. But breaking free from the cycle of these formulaic movies was going to be tough. I wanted to try new things, but I didn't want to rush it. Maybe one day, I'd get the chance to show what I was really capable of. For now, I just kept doing what I was told and hoped for better days ahead.